So we will get started. And so hello to everyone, and thank you so much for joining tonight's very exciting crowd conversation, which marks the launch of a groundbreaking New York State white paper, Constructing a Circular Economy Through Deconstruction and Building Material Reuse. I'm Gretchen Worth, the project director of the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning, which supports New York State communities working toward a more equitable, climate resilient built environment. The Christopherson Center is one of the founding partners of CROWD, which stands for Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development, and the organizer of Crowd Conversations. And we're so pleased to have members of the White Paper Project team join us to share highlights from that paper, which we hope will support the efforts that so many of you are involved with to create a circular construction economy, and to also encourage those of you who are not yet involved to join us in this work. So before we get started, there are just a couple of housekeeping details. We'll try to keep this conversation to an hour, including the Q&A, and we're hoping for a lot of discussion tonight. So please type your questions in the chat as we go along, and then we can jump right into those at the end of the panel presentation. And please keep yourselves muted so that everybody can hear our panels. So we have people joining us tonight from New York State and beyond. I'm based in Ithaca, so I would like to acknowledge that Ithaca is on the traditional homelands of the Guy Cahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Guy Cahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guy Cahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guy Cahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So our moderator tonight, Dr. Jenny Minner, is Director of Graduate Studies and an Associate Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. She directs the Just Places Lab, a platform for research and creative action centered on community memory, imagination, and the just care of places. She's also a founder of the Crowd Network and is the faculty mentor to the Cornell Undergrad Research to Action Youth Student Organization. And Jenny is also a member of the White Paper Project team. So Jenny, thank you so much for being here tonight to moderate, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gretchen. Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here to help share and introduce the significant piece of research on building a circular economy in New York State. It's been such a pleasure to be a part of this collaborative research project. And I see some of you on the call who have reviewed an advanced version of this paper and provided vital feedback. Some of you have contributed to the research, and some of you on the call have inspired this report. So thank you so much for joining us. I think we'll have an excellent opportunity tonight to walk through the white paper, talk about what's in it, the significance of its findings, and what we hope will come out of this research at the state and local levels and through private and nonprofit innovation. So I'd like to begin this evening by introducing my colleagues in the order of the presentation. So I'll introduce Felix, Wyeth, and Courtney. I'd also like to shout out to Diane Cohen of Finger Lakes Reuse and of course Gretchen of the Susan Christopherson Center, who were really central to dreaming up this research paper that would help articulate the importance of circularity and its potential in our state. So I'm hoping we may hear from them again when we get to the Q&A component of the crowd conversation. And as Gretchen mentions, please do put your questions in the chat as we go along. So first, an introduction to Professor Felix Heisel, who is an assistant professor and the director of the Circular Construction Lab at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. He's a faculty fellow at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability and a graduate field member of Architecture, Systems Engineering, and Matter Design Computation. Felix is also a founding partner of the Crowd Collaborative Network. Next, I'd like to introduce Wyeth Augustine-Marceil, who's an industrial designer and a graduate of Cornell University's Master of Regional Planning program. Since 2021, Wyeth has worked with Crowd, the Just Places Lab, and the Circular Construction Lab, focusing on policy strategies to advance a more circular built environment within New York State. And finally, I'd like to introduce Courtney Bauer, who is a PhD candidate in regional science at Cornell University, specializing in the intersection of innovation and sustainability. He's a researcher in the Just Places Lab who focuses on the economic impacts and built environment transformations associated with the transition to a circular economy. So let's please warmly welcome these speakers with virtual hand claps and celebratory emojis. Thank you for joining us. And I'll turn it over to Professor Heisel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. What you see on the screen, many of you probably downloaded the paper already. We also put the link into the chat if you're still interested in downloading it now. It's free, it's available, and we're so happy that it's public now after working on it for an extensive period of time. As Jenny and Gretchen mentioned already, and maybe Wyeth, if you can go to the next slide, this document is really a incredibly collaborative effort. It has a kind of crowd editorial team that was mentioned already with Wyeth, Jennifer, Dan, Gretchen, and myself. But it goes far beyond that. We had students and fellow faculty members from Cornell helping us in the research. I want to shout out to Denise Ramsey and Lori Leonard from the business school and global development, respectively. Courtney is on the call with us today, but then we had Roma Patel and Jumbo Huang, Annie Stewart, and Kaya Foti from different departments at Cornell, which also kind of represents the interdisciplinarity of this research and the need for interdisciplinarity in developing a circular system. We have had external consultancy partners like Brett Guy from Material Reuse and also Build Reuse. And a shout out to David for the fantastic graphics and layout of this paper. The story of this white paper started actually several years ago. So it's grounded in, of course, the work of crowd, which you're familiar with since this is the crowd conversation, so I don't need to introduce that. But this group started from sort of a concerned a group of partners witnessing demolitions in the area and quickly advanced into an advocacy group that now is working really New York statewide. And over years, we've had conversations about how to best put out our findings, how to help develop a sort of foundational understanding of the status quo of the industry, both demolition and deconstruction and reuse in New York State. But this conversation quickly advanced into by adding partners to it, and some of these partners I do want to mention. First and foremost, New York State Assembly member Dr. Anna Kellis, and then in extension, New York State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, who joined this conversation and really felt the need for a white paper to convince other stakeholders of the need of new policy and legislation moving forward. And so with the help of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, we were then able to found a group and finance the writing of this white paper over the last couple of months leading up to today. And as Jenny also mentioned, the benefit of crowd having this extended network of stakeholders and partners in federal agencies, in New York State agencies, with the industry, really gave us the ability to bring in important and really well-positioned reviewers that all added their knowledge to this paper. Next slide, Wyeth. And so just very quickly, why this paper, why reuse? I don't think any of you really needs to hear this again, but I think it's a helpful start into an evening like today, just to understand again the importance of our industry, the built environment, in the bigger, larger picture. So if we take all the buildings across the full life cycle into consideration, the built environment is responsible for more than 50% of materials that are taken out of the Earth's crust, more than 40% of solid waste that is being produced, and roughly 40% of carbon dioxide emissions. And the reasons why I'm bringing this up, next slide, is on the one hand side, of course, to understand the impact that our industry is having, but also, and I think that's actually more important in this conversation, to kind of look at the time scale and how quickly we would need to reverse these impacts moving forward. And so if you look at this slide from Architecture 2030, to stay within the goals that were agreed on, the Paris climate goals, meaning to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrialized times, we would need to reduce carbon emissions from the building environment by 65% in the next 6 years. And so just let that sink in for a second. 6 years in the built environment is nothing, right? That's basically the life cycle or the planning cycle of one building, or maybe two, but we have to move significantly and drastically and quickly towards a very different system to be able to reach these goals. And so, next slide. The circular economy is what we would understand as one or the answer to this. So phasing out linear aspects of the current economic system and moving towards circular systems, specifically focusing on reuse as the most sustainable, most local, and most effective circular economy solution in the kit of parts that we have to choose from. Next slide. As we noticed, or as we were able to prove, maybe that's a better way to formulate it, during the writing of the white paper, the impacts of reuse are really far beyond sort of the environmental aspects, but they are economic and they are social. They have to do with job creation, with economic impacts, with material reuse, and the creation of a new market and a new infrastructural system for New York State. And the other aspect that we noticed is that, of course, New York State is a very has a very great foundation for this. If we look at most recent papers that were published or ordinances that were passed, specifically looking, for example, at the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the 2022 executive order, or maybe most significant, the 2023 New York State Solid Waste Management Plan, that actually has the circular economy in its title or subtitle, building the circular economy through sustainable material management. So all of this sets the ground for the recommendations and the research that you're about to hear from Wyeth in more detail.
Quick overview of the structure of the paper. We're going to walk kind of through this kind of at a higher level, and then we'll get to some questions at the end. But like Felix mentioned, we kind of discuss the issue at a global scale, and we also then spend the majority of the paper applying a New York specific lens to this problem and to the solutions that we foresee going forward. And so we brought a lot of specificity from those plans that Felix mentioned, the work that's already being done around the state. We pull inspiration from all of the work that's happening across the country. We then tried to paint a picture of what this would look like at scale in New York State, what that would look like for an economic and workforce development lens, from a waste lens, and other lenses. And then we look at how to get there, and we lay out, I think it's 19, but a pretty comprehensive list of policy and practice recommendations that some are legislative, some are administrative, some happen within state agencies, but really kind of a comprehensive playlist, hopefully, to move New York State toward a circular construction economy. And so that starts kind of with talking a little bit more about the issues with the linear construction economy specific to New York, but also then kind of what we see the alternative being. As Felix began to talk about, I think a lot of people are familiar with this, but we know that demolition and landfilling of building materials has all sorts of negative implications socially, culturally, environmentally, and economically, especially, is kind of the argument we really tried to prioritize, knowing that that is an argument that resonates with a large group of people. And so we know that demolition is quick and efficient upfront for the people who are doing the demolition, but it has implications for the societies and for our economy longer scale. And then we see deconstruction as kind of an option and an alternative to demolition to kind of mitigate some of those challenges. So we can, if we end the lifespan of a building, we have an opportunity to extend the lifespan of the materials, make some economic activity down the line, defer waste, and then kind of support broader New York State climate goals. And then especially we see, for the purpose of this report, we see that deconstruction and reuse, kind of the left half of this graphic, has higher economic factors throughout many different measurements. So direct sales and goods, capital purchases, protection of the natural environment, we see that deconstruction reuse is actually the better economic choice once the infrastructure is in place, once we commit to it wholesale. But then as also kind of an important piece of context to put deconstruction and reuse into context of a broader circular and sustainable built environment, we actually see deconstruction as only an alternative to demolition, whereas other methods that extend the lifespan of a building, like maintenance, like adaptive reuse, like expanding a building, or even moving an entire building, are all typically preferred from an environmental perspective than deconstruction material reuse. So it's really important to see deconstruction as an alternative to demolition, but not necessarily as an alternative to extending the lifespan of a building in whole. And then to kind of look at a New York specific, we really tried to leverage all of the research that's been done primarily through the New York State Solid Waste Management Plan, put together by the New York State DEC, which was a really fabulous resource for us. And it brought a lot of things to light. One thing that we did have to work kind of hard, though, was to understand the scale of the demolition problem in New York State. And so this was an analysis we did, and we estimate that there's between 15,000 and 20,000 full building residential demolitions in New York State every single year. And so this is only full building demolitions for residential buildings. It's not even considering commercial structures, partial demolitions, renovations, all of those things, but it just starts to kind of touch on the scale of this challenge just in New York State. And then another New York State finding is, this is directly from the New York State Solid Waste Management Plan. C&D is actually the largest waste stream in the state. C&D specifically from buildings is about 40% of that, which is higher than the national average. And then when we look at New York State's recycling of C&D, there's a fairly high recycling rate. It's about 66% statewide. But when you look at the materials that are being recycled, it's largely aggregates, concrete, brick, asphalt, and things like that that are being ground and used for road base or landfill cover. And so a lot of materials that have high reuse potential and high recycling potential are kind of slipping through the cracks of the system. That's further exemplified by when you look at the recycling rates and reuse rates for different material streams. So for infrastructure, roads and bridges in New York State, about 80% is recycled. So there's a really robust system for that. If you look only at buildings, only about 42% is recycled, and reuse is happening at a very small, largely informal, but growing 0.4% of all materials. And then if you look at deconstruction, you can see the potential of deconstruction. So this is at a per project basis, up to 25% of building materials could be reused, whereas 65% could be recycled. So a really high diversion rate per project. And then if we can scale that, we can start to improve the recycling and reuse rates across the state. And then this is a breakdown of kind of where kind of the diversion and the discard rate of all C&D materials just from buildings in New York State. So we can start to see that aggregates like concrete, rock, and brick have a fairly high discard rate, and those being heavier materials kind of skew the overall recycling rate higher than if you excluded those materials. And you see readily reusable materials like wood at a very high discard rate, about 70%. And then other highly recyclable materials with established recycling chains in other places and in New York State, like asphalt roofing, drywall, and paper are still highly discarded in New York State. And we also feel like this is a really important challenge to tackle at a statewide level, because especially in New York, it's widely varied on how recycling is done and how deconstruction is done and reuse is done. So this is just one example. If you look at the kind of highlighted column down the middle, there's some DEC regions with very high recycling rates, about 66%, and then there's some regions where there's virtually no C&D recycling options. And so to have a statewide solution is really crucial to apply this evenly across a very big state. And another perspective we tried to do is to think about where all these materials are going, and they're going to most corners of the state. So this is an overview of all landfills in New York State that accepted C&D waste in 2022, broken down by the tonnage, to give us a sense of where those materials are going. And what we kind of uncovered in this analysis is they're going to all over the state, but there's a concentration at Seneca Meadows landfill in upstate New York, and the town of Brookhaven landfill on Long Island. Those are the two largest acceptors of C&D waste in the state, and they just so happen to either be stopping accepting C&D or closing potentially in the next year. And so this really underscores an urgency beyond the larger that is going to be felt very directly in New York State. So that's about 32% of all C&D materials in the state potentially won't have anywhere to go in as soon as a year. And so that's kind of the challenge. And we also feel like deconstruction and reuse at scale can be an answer to some of those questions, and tried to paint a picture of, if we can scale deconstruction or reuse, what that would look like from an economic perspective. So I'll pass it to Courtney to talk this over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wyeth. I appreciate it. If you could just advance to the next slide here, I'd like to tee this up. Perfect. So what we started with was a what if scenario, a question. If tomorrow New York State were to mandate a certain percentage of buildings to be deconstructed, 50% or 75%, what would the economic benefit of that be? And now that's a pretty challenging question. That's a multi-layered question. So as we walk through the next few slides, what you're going to see are estimates, total economic estimate, total jobs estimate. But more than that, it's trying to estimate the value of a given building deconstructed, and then multiplying that by some percentage here. So if you could just go to the next slide, what I'd like to show is the initial estimate that we start with is this 271,000 tons on the left versus 421,000 tons on the right. And this is a guess really of the total amount of deconstructed buildings under these scenarios. And what we're going to do is convert these to an economic value, and then we're going to take that value, that number, and we're going to put it into an economic model. Some of you might have heard of this. This is called economic impact analysis, and the engine that drives that is called input-output. I won't get into the details, of course, but what we're doing is looking at the shock if you are transforming the New York economy. If you're mandating deconstruction at a certain percentage, it shocks the system, and that produces more value over time. If you could go to the next slide, Wyeth. And so what we have here is a system where 50% or 75% of buildings are required to be deconstructed. And what that means is there's going to be a lot more economic activity. And one of our first questions was, who is conducting that economic activity? If you are familiar with how industries are segmented and bucketed within an economy, there are over 1,000 industry subsectors. There's a lot of different industry types. There's major sectors like deconstruction, and then there's very, very small sectors like construction, and then very small sectors like deconstruction. So we wanted to first locate where that deconstruction activity was happening, and then we wanted to try and get an appropriate sense of which large sector in an economy would be shocked or would be changed if all of a sudden New York State mandated one of these scenarios a particular percentage of deconstructed buildings. If you could go to the next slide here, and I'll start to show you some of the actual values. So as I've said, we went out and we did these initial estimates where the total tonnage increase. We're trying to estimate the value that then is put into the New York State economy, and that value impacts a broader industry, the construction industry or construction sector, and then smaller subsectors. So these estimates about $872 million direct increase. So that is a shock for scenario 1, and 1.4 billion is a shock for scenario 2. And these are going into an economy. This is where I get up, and then I'm doing modeling. This is the economic impact modeling, where essentially what you're doing is you imagine an economy as a system of connected gears. All these industries are buying in from each other. There's increased economic impact or economic growth as industries shift and change, buy and sell more as these new materials are moving into the economy. Wyeth, if you could go to the next slide. So we have these direct economic impacts. That is the mandated increase in deconstruction, and then indirect impacts. This is the economy starting to do what it does. We could say it is industries are buying and selling from each other, and this is expanding into 1.28 billion and 2 billion. And then if you go to the next slide, this is going to be the last slide. An economy is not just industries; it is also households. When you include households in, there is an expansion of these direct economic impacts. There's induced effects where households are gaining more dollars over time. They're increasing their wage growth. They're spending into that economy. So they're essentially being incentivized by the transformation of the economy, industries buying and selling from each other to produce more economic value. Just a few caveats here. The 1.9 billion on the left and the 3.05 billion on the right, these are not values that accrue immediately to an economy. An economy is live and dynamic. It changes over time. Therefore, you can expect in 10, 15, 20 years this total value to accrue as the economy changes, given the mandated deconstruction. So again, these are just scenarios. There's a lot of caveats here with the economic modeling. I'm happy to answer any questions. We've also provided those in the appendix as well, but we do see positive economic value over time and increased job growth with our phase 1 estimates. Thank you, Wyeth.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, and that's, I think, part of a really strong argument we can make for not only does deconstruction reuse have an environmental and public health benefit, but we feel like it is an economic boon because it creates so many jobs throughout the kind of the lifespan of a building and its materials. And so when we started looking to making recommendations for New York State to actualize some of that potential, we as part of Crowd, we're kind of aware of all of these things happening in New York State. And as we dug in, we recognized that New York State is already very well positioned to approach deconstruction or reuse at scale, and especially at a New York State level. And so these are just kind of a select group of already enacted or passed state level actions. From the New York DEC, which we've referenced, there's a handful of specific action items within that plan that are specific to C&D, reuse, and deconstruction. The CLCPA, which is kind of New York State's landmark plan to make it a leader in sustainability, has at least 3 items that are specific to circularity in the built environment. State agencies are directed to become more sustainable and focus on their C&D materials. And then there's a number of other related policies and approaches on the books within several different agencies. There's different agencies working on it. There's municipalities throughout the state who are thinking about deconstruction ordinances or other ways to mandate or move deconstruction forward or incentivize it. And so it's really kind of fertile ground in New York State, which is a huge advantage. Not to mention all of the different organizations like Crowd and Finger Lakes Reuse and all of these places that are practicing this on a daily basis. So New York State is already really well positioned. And then when we look at kind of what we feel like needs to happen to move New York State into that next step into the future and kind of to realize some of those potential, we've laid out 19, I think, count them, recommendations across 5 different categories. And so we recognize that it's crucial to build the workforce, the market, and the infrastructure to support all of the different individual actors throughout the state. We recognize that New York State, as the largest purchaser of building materials in the state, has huge potential to lead by example and kind of put the money where the values are or have been purported to be. And then some kind of broader things around supporting long-term circularity and supporting kind of this movement as a whole. And so we won't walk through all of them. There's some really wonderful detail through the document, but just to kind of highlight a couple of those things. A trained workforce and contractor, a group of contractors throughout the state is really crucial because deconstruction, while it is kind of a simple concept, it can be complex and it can be dangerous. So contractors and employees need to be trained on how to do this safely, how to maximize the value of material. But also, deconstruction jobs are a really great pathway toward other trades jobs. So learning how to use hand tools and power tools and all those things is kind of a great step into the workforce. Building the market is perhaps the biggest question that deconstruction advocates get. If we have all these materials, where are they going to go? And so we propose that rather than starting with a full mandate across the state on you have to deconstruction these X number of buildings or these buildings, we really want to work we propose that the state provides incentives for municipalities to pass deconstruction ordinances, and then that the state really backs that up with targeted funding to make sure that municipalities aren't kind of operating without the proper support, especially because it is kind of, there have been some examples of municipalities struggling to do so, but there's also been some success stories, and that also often comes with state level support. And then infrastructure is crucial. These materials have to be processed, they have to be sold, they have to be kind of find new pathways back into new buildings or back into refurbished buildings. And so the space and the capacity to be able to do that is really crucial. We see a couple different avenues of the state supporting that through grants, through potentially a surcharge on tipping fees that could go directly towards reuse programs that could be redistributed to communities throughout the state, and other things like that. And then, like we mentioned, the state plays a really big role because they manage billions and billions of dollars in construction projects. And similar to the federal government strategy to purchase specific materials that are either lower embodied carbon, or in this case, we proposed reused materials for capital projects, represents a really important opportunity to stimulate the private sector by starting to purchase those materials. And so that could either be in the form of passing or categorizing all reused materials as green materials in the state system, requiring a minimum number of or percentage of reused building materials in state projects, or things like that. So the state plays a really crucial role. And then just some kind of learnings that we came across kind of in the course of the work that Crowd does, and then trying to compile all of the information that goes into this report it's really hard to get a sense of what the C&D material movement is in the state. So one of those ways would just be modernizing the way that data is collected, perhaps creating standards across the state so we have a better sense of how many buildings are coming down, where they're coming down, what kind of materials are coming out of them. Even kind of modest amounts of information about that would really help markets develop to be able to react to those supplies. And I'll pass it over to Felix to summarize that and take us home.
Thank you so much, Wyeth and Courtney. Yeah, my role is an easy one now. We just have 2 slides left to kind of lead us into the conversation. And just to summarize, so we see an incredible economic, ecologic, and social benefit from a shift towards deconstruction and building material reuse. And if you sort of summarize these many 19 policy recommendations, then they really try to cover aspects of data collection, a robust market, leveraging existing purchasing powers, encouraging local policy adoptions, and targeting workforce development, kind of in summary. Some aspects, and I think we'll get to them. I've been reading the many questions that you've already put into the chat, so I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Maybe if you go to the next slide, I do want to thank all of the authors again, and kind of lead towards what's next. I think our hope is that, of course, this paper encourages the many aspects that we just mentioned. I also see really interesting comments already in the chat from Dr. Anna Callas, for example, about future steps. But our hope is really that this is leading to advocacy, that we are encouraging a conversation, that we're getting as much feedback as possible to build on this, to work towards additional white papers that really drive and encourage legislation. And so we're really looking forward to this open conversation that comes out of this paper. And while we have the question and answers, the next slide is kind of a couple of voices from outside of the team, just as an encouragement for us, maybe mostly, about the impact of this paper and the download link again. And thank you everyone so much, and looking forward to conversation.
Right. Thank you, the 3 of you, for presenting this white paper. I see we have a queue of people lining up to ask questions. We have questions in the chat. I'm thinking perhaps we start first with a question from the chat in the order within the queue, and then we can come back to the 2 of you who have questions and can ask in person. So first, from Chris Brandt: how might New York State support these efforts at reuse of building materials while still meeting the safety requirements and calculated structural loading of building materials required by the building code? it would seem that this would be a significant liability on the part of the design professional to specify materials of unknown or unquantifiable quality.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. I think this is a crucial question. And there's a couple of recommendations in this white paper that address this question from different aspects. The first aspect is that we need much better data about our existing buildings, and in extension to that, about the materials that come out of these buildings. So this has to do with technology development, about, so for example, scanning technologies to know ideally in advance of a deconstruction what kind of materials come out of this building and how might we be able to use those. A second step is a certification or recertification of these materials. One of the recommendations that we have in the paper is to follow up on a current federal EPA development towards environmental product declarations for salvaged materials, so that we're offering not only a better understanding of material qualities and specifications, but also ways into existing procurement strategies that might, for example, require an EPD when you buy or start to plan with salvaged materials. And then the last part of this is adjustments to the code so that not the professional themselves have to take on this liability with their signature, which is a possibility already, as you point out, but that there is a certain amount of planning safety and a framework that really takes reused material into consideration. And this is something that is also actually ongoing in several different parts of the country. For example, towards standards for timber reuse, where specific material quantities are automatically regraded or assigned a calculation value, so that there is no insecurity for the design professionals on how to use these materials.
Thank you. I'd like to see if Carrie Augustine would like to ask your question. I saw that you were in the queue. And if not, how about Jesse? Would you like to ask your question? Carrie or Jesse, either one of you? Okay, we can move on. Jason asks, what's required to be a deconstruction contractor in New York State?
I could take that one. Yeah, currently there is no state certification or requirement or training in New York State. We've seen a couple municipalities who have passed deconstruction ordinances, like Portland and I believe San Antonio, create their own deconstruction contractor certification and training. Build Reuse, which is kind of a national deconstruction entity, also has a deconstruction training curricula. But that's kind of what we're proposing the state do, is either to leverage one of those existing training and certification programs, or develop their own to have standards around what is required to be a deconstruction contractor. But certainly things like safety, like knowing destinations for materials, like maximizing the potential value by making certain decisions on how a building is deconstructed are the sort of things that, and making sure that they're actually, that materials are being reused at the end of a deconstruction, are some of the things that would potentially go into a deconstruction contractor certification or training.
Great, thanks, Wyeth. So moving along down the chat, I see a comment or question. Doesn't the deconstruction process destroy most of the building material? And a comment from the audience that demolition does, but deconstruction does not. Is there more that we want to say here to sort of elaborate on the research that has been done here at Cornell comparing demolition and deconstruction?
I mean, that's one of the key arguments for deconstruction, right? Demolition, because of the process, destroys almost any economic value of the materials by like the excavator coming in, right? Eating the building up, munching it all into small pieces, and then putting that into a dumpster and carrying the dumpster to the landfill, right? And so deconstruction is the opposite of that. It's a careful and systematic dismantling of the building into its components with the goal to maximize the utility and value of these materials in the process. And so that is the key difference. And with it come many other societal and environmental benefits as well.
We have another question from Chris and also Bill Hilgendorf. Additionally, what efforts have been made thus far to quantify the additional cost for these deconstructed or salvaged materials and potential added labor costs to adapt them to a construction project? Without monetary support subsidy, it would seem that this would only exacerbate the construction affordability crisis in many upstate cities. This assumed added material cost would likely be less of an issue in larger economies like New York City.
I can take it if no one else is. So we did our own research, which actually ended up proving comparative research projects across the nation, that of course deconstruction, if you just compare the direct labor cost, for example, deconstruction is more expensive. We have about 6 times more people on the site for a deconstruction project than we have for a demolition project. And the interesting thing here for us is that the argumentation should be turned around, right? It is, of course, more expensive, but it also pays more wages. It brings people into the workforce, and it ends up actually, as we showed in the economic analysis, adds significant economic value to the overall economy. Now, that doesn't necessarily help the building owner directly, and we understand that. And so the point there is that deconstruction generates value in the materials that are reclaimed from the site. And so those have either a resale value, or in other case scenarios can be, at least for residential buildings, deducted from income taxes through a donation value. And if you, in both strategies, we can show that we're actually economically comparable in both demolition and deconstruction. So for the case study that we had here in Ithaca, the resale value of the material basically offsets the additional labor cost. In other scenarios across the nation, we've had similar situations with the tax deduction.
And I'd also add, from a supply side, we've seen a number of cities who are seeing that the materials from deconstructed projects are actually a really good source of construction materials, affordable construction materials, so oftentimes for half the cost of virgin materials. And I think while there are certainly barriers to salvage and reuse right now, I think also with scale, that will become more affordable to spec those materials and include them into new construction.
I see that we have Assembly Member Anna Kellis in the audience, and a comment in the chat. I've written a bill that will be live in the next week or two that creates a deconstruction ordinance with a grant program from the state to incentivize municipalities to adopt the deconstruction ordinance template outlined in the bill. I will be introducing a bill outlining a deconstruction certification through the DOL for contractors, and a CDD, Database Modernization Act, to modernize the CDD material, the DEC collects data with standards of what material is coming out of the projects and where they're going. A front-end online marketplace can be built from this database. Incredible amounts of momentum here addressing many of the recommendations that we've pointed out in the research paper or the white paper. So moving on to Anne Erling's comment or question. Do you see any building designed for deconstruction yet in New York State?
It's a good question. Maybe I need to back up a little bit and first talk a little bit about design for disassembly. So there's one part of this that addresses the existing built environment that has not been designed for disassembly, that has been built with sort of eternity in mind, and sometimes uses connection details that are really hard to access, and where we're struggling in the deconstruction to make these materials separate at their highest utility and value. And that, for example, also includes contaminants, things that we're addressing in the white paper, like asbestos or lead, other hindering barriers towards their most effective reutilization. The counter proposal to this, and hopefully the standard sometime soon moving forward, is designed for disassembly, where we as an industry change the way we operate and design buildings with reuse in mind, meaning we're designing buildings with reversible connections, with materials that are durable and long-term, that are healthy, that don't have any contaminants in them, which is a significant change to the current status quo. But I think a necessary change in how we operate, really having this kind of circularity in mind across all stages moving forward. To this extent, I do not know a case study in New York State right now that fulfills all of the requirements that I just put out. But of course, there are really interesting projects coming up that have parts of these components already implemented in their design strategies.
So we're beginning to run short on time. So what I'd like to do is run the next two questions together, asking about sort of the technical basis for the paper, and if there's similar research that we consulted or that is being done at the national level, for instance, by the GSA, Department of Defense, and also the question, were there any experts from the demolition or recycling industries consulted for the study to understand the opportunities for deconstruction to complement these activities rather than replace them, or the potential negative impacts on the existing recycling infrastructure, which already suffers from numerous barriers, such as regulatory and market barriers from poor quality composite materials, toxicity concerns, hazardous materials, high labor costs, etc. I would say, yes, we did, over the course of several years, actually talk with deconstruction and demolition contractors who provided really important insights into some of the current barriers into realizing a circular economy. So I think that many of those sources were consulted, but I'll turn it over to Felix, Wyeth, or Courtney, if you'd like to add more to those questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, Jenny. And I think there's also for the recycling, C&D recycling industry, I think reuse could be similarly a benefit, because as we talked about, only about up to 25% of building materials can be reused. And by nature of a deconstruction project, those materials are typically source separated. So I think there's also potential for a better feedstock into recycling infrastructure, and then potentially higher recycling rates coming out of that. So I think these are not two activities that are at odds. I think they complement each other. And from the perspective of this paper, reuse should be prioritized, and any benefit in recycling is also great to divert those materials and kind of reclaim some of the value embedded within them.
I hope Terry still heard that answer. The direct answer to his comment in the chat.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. I want to pause here and see if Felix, Wyeth, or Courtney, would you like to pick from these questions that are in the chat, or would you like me to select one, or?
There's one question, maybe that's an interesting clarification about sort of the other sectors. We talked a lot about residential, but what's the commercial tenant improvement and other sectors? We've had a really tough time to get numbers about deconstruction or demolition projects in New York State. What we were able to find are numbers for residential, which is the reason why these analyses are, as Courtney mentioned, are really based on residential. There's an incredible important potential in the commercial sector that we haven't really quantified yet, but the overturn in commercial projects is even quicker than it is in residential projects. So if we don't even have to talk about all building demolition, just the renewal of shop fronts of there's so much material being overturned in the commercial sector that if it's designed for disassembly, if it's done correctly, offers yet another large material quantity that can be addressed completely different from the current status quo.
I think we're at the hour. I want to pause and see if there are any other last comments or that you'd like to make before we wrap this up.
I think just one thing I would like to add to the folks who are maybe calling in from out of state or work beyond New York. While this paper does really try to dive into New York State specifics, we hope there's a lot of research and finding that is actionable and able to leverage outside of New York. We've compiled kind of a national picture of what's going on, and then just kind of some of the arguments are generalizable. So just because much of it is New York specific, we hope that it can be more useful beyond the state boundaries. And thanks for tuning in.
Wonderful. I see many positive comments rolling in. Thank you so much for joining us to learn more about this important white paper. We look forward to continuing the crowd conversation around this and the many other research projects that are ongoing. Thank you.